Good afternoon, respected delegates and scholars and teachers and everyone. My name is Arzu. My name is Arzu Mirza, and I am student of Political Science Department, 4th semester. And my co-authors are Mr. Ashwani Kumar Singh. He is an assistant professor in Ganpat Rai Sahai College, and another one co-author is Abhay Singh, who is also a scholar and a student of political science. So here's the overview. So slide change the So next. So let's discuss about my research paper without further ado, which is economic interdependence and trade restrictions in and again trajectory and future implications. So in overview, we will discuss about introduction, objectives, literature review, and research findings, limitations, scope, and conclusion. So without any delay, what is economic interdependence? So economic interdependence is something which is impacted, which is caused due to globalization and multilateral forums. And India shifted from self-reliance to economic interdependence, and mostly it happened due to LPG reforms, which is economic reforms of 1991. But with deglobalization, what happened due to economic interdependence, there comes a time period of 2008, which is so next slide. With 2008, which was the global financial crisis, in which countries sort of started to increase their protectionism, and again that kind of protectionism 2.0 was seen during the time of COVID-19 pandemic, when shocks created uncertainty in the economy and countries was trying to protect their domestic economy. So economic interdependence is equal to mutual sensitivity because of porous borders and vulnerability which is exposed due to the globalization, and trade restrictions rises because of these kind of protectionist policies to safeguard their domestic interest. So the objective of my research paper is to analyze the impact of economic independence and trade restrictions which is imposed by USA. The recent trade tariff wars which is happening between US and China, and also the sanctions which is being imposed by USA on Russia due to Russia-Ukraine war, and how these kind of sanctions and trade restrictions going to impact India, and how India will strategically balance its ties. So in literature review part, I started with the classical economists, Adam Smith and David Ricardo's theory of laissez-faire and comparative advantage, and where in contrast to this, Cohen gave the theory of complex interdependence, which means that unilaterally no country can be benefit through trade, so bilateral and multilateral engagements are required and multiple channels of interaction is required. And because of the porous borders and because of these multilateral front interactions, there is a decline in the hard power, because you cannot go with a full-fledged war with any country, because there is so much at the stake. So in this global world scenario, in this geopolitics, you cannot go with a full war. If we say that India is having bad ties with China, but they cannot go in a on-and-on war with China due to the impact that there is so much is at stake. And economic ties create both cooperation as well as vulnerability. Cooperation in so many fronts like trade, economy, health sector, and whatever you name it. But it also creates vulnerability, because when conflicts arise, there is no way that we can go for a hard power thing. We have to deal with the negotiations. So it is said that whoever in the global politics controls the economy will control the world order, which means that world politics is now shaped by their economic linkages. So my research methodology is descriptive, where I just use the exploratory method, in which I use the authentic source of published data, and in method I use both qualitative and quantitative analysis of their published records. My research findings are that global trends in which the interdependence has led to the rise of protectionism. Somehow it has led to the rise of protectionism, and it also says that due to COVID-19 shock, economies are very much aware that they have to protect their domestic industries. Along with cooperation, they have to domestically enhance their manufacturing sector, services sector. This can be taken. We can take an example where China a sort of supply India with the raw material part, which is active pharmaceutical ingredients. But during COVID-19, that supply got disrupted, and that is why countries are thinking to shift their base from China. So economic interdependence is somewhere or the other way is impacting the relations. And the US-China trade war also impacting, in which 26.8 percentage point of increase in tariff imports, and there is a stability period which is happened from September 2024 to Jan, but this lasts for a very short period of time. So if you see from the graph that in the second administrative time period of Trump, the sanctions increased and the tariff was on increasing. That China put the sanctions tariff of 31.9%. So next, the graph thing. And in retaliation, US also put the tariff of 47.5%. But if we see, so next, the graph area, please. And with the rest of the world, the sanctions, if we see the tariffs imposed by US with the rest of the world is 18.4%, whereas China in retaliation, although it is less, but it is 6.5%. So next, India, if we see the India-US trade trajectory, so India has a trade surplus with US, but US has imposed 25% tariff along with 25% punitive tariff, because India was importing Russian oil, and to put pressure on Russia because of Russia-Ukraine war, to put pressure so that Russia would stop war with Ukraine. So it has impacted 55% of Indian export in shrimp, textiles, gems, etc. So if we see that although the India-US trade has increased significantly, but there is a lot more need to be done. And Indian imports of Indian, if we see that India and Russia energy interdependence, which is huge, where India is importing 89% of its crude oil from Russia, and it is also because Russia is selling their crude oil in discounted form, like Russian oil share rose from 35 to 36% after Western sanctions, because Russia is selling it in a discounted form. And US sanctions has resulted a kind of like India needs to diversify their resources, and there is a global rise in prices of oils, and there is increased import bill from $6 to $7 billion. What are the future implications if we see, and how India will strategically respond to this? So India, although up till this point of time has avoided retaliatory measures, and India is trying to diplomatically engage with US, and even trying to maintain bilateral relations and multilateral engagements. Recently, India-US has signed their interim trade agreement, where India sort of like said that they will not buy oil from Russia, or although they will not cut their like trade zero nahi karenge usko, but they will halt their oil production. And India also said that they signed the deal of Mission 500 with US, in which they will have interacted in technology, health sector, and aircraft materials. And also US they declare that they will cut their tariff from 50% to 18%. And there is a limitation to my research, and there is a scope as well. Limitation is there is a very less time I got for preparing this research paper, and my focus was only on India. But there is a great scope where we can conduct this research on a long-term basis, and we can do a separate study in which we can study India-US relations, India-China relations, and India-Russia, and we can combine it with the study, like seeking the impact, how it will impact the global scenario. I would like to conclude it that although economic interdependence has deepened post 1991, global shocks has impacted India's relations, but India needs to diversify their trade partners and strengthen their domestic capacity. And they have to maintain strategic ties with US, China, and Russia in a very strategic manner. And these are my references from which I have completed my research paper. Thank you.
I have a question. You talk about India, China, and USA, and all three. My question is to you is the trade deficit of India and China is more than $100 billion, and trade surplus of India with America or the USA is $40 billion. Why is so? Why is so that so big country and the modern economy of the world, America, is trade deficit in India, but China is trade surplus? Why is so, and what suggestion would you give to India, Indian government, Indian policy makers to cope with this problem that the thing with China is acting with China and is having that trade deficit of $100 billion plus dollars? So, what suggestion would you like to give to the
So the question is that US has a trade surplus with India has a trade surplus with USA, and with China it has a trade deficit. And why it is so? So if we see that both the countries, India and China, got their independence at the very same point of time. But what happened with India? India's agriculture sector, which is primary sector, got developed, and there is a timeline where we first develop the primary sector, then we move on to the secondary sector, and then we move on to the tertiary sector. But what happened in Indian case that although we developed our primary sector, but there is a gap where we weren't able to meet with the secondary sector. Like the secondary sector portion, which is manufacturing sector, is almost about, if I'm not wrong, it is 17%. But services sector increased. So in that case, whatever things, and in China, what they did, they did their research work and they developed their primary sector. Then they focused on their manufacturing sector. You name anything, China is developing. China is way ahead in technology, and that is why it is more cheaper to import things from China.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Your answer why very slow. Would you give any suggestion? Though there are many other reasons, because China is 1999 its market and India opened its market in 1999. Okay, what are the reasons? Now give some suggestions.
So for my suggestion for India is they need to focus on their manufacturing sector, and there is a great scope where India could focus on their technology, which is as we talk about the comparative advantage. Like in international relations, each nation will get benefit if they will focus on what they do their best. So in India, there is a huge hub of knowledge, and it's high time that we should focus on our manufacturing sector, and instead of focusing on petty issues, we should just focus on developing trade, developing AI, and which is very much a good scope where we focus on artificial intelligence and technology sector. And it's high time that we should engage bilaterally and multilaterally so that we could counter China's salami slicing policies, because China is being aggressive policy maker, and it's been doing these kind of things like Belt and Road Initiative, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and trying to encircle India like string of false theories. So, in order to counter all those things, it's very high time for India to focus on their strengths and focus on their ability, which they can do better, and take the comparative advantage.
Next presentation is from Dr. Sanjay from Department of Commerce, Bareilly College.
गुड आफ्टरनून सभी को। मंच पे उपस्थित सभी विद्वानगण, विदुषीगण, मंच के सामने उपस्थित सभी शिक्षकगण, रिसर्च स्कॉलर्स और स्टूडेंट्स। मेरा नाम संजय कुमार है। मैं यहाँ पे बरेली कॉलेज में कॉमर्स डिपार्टमेंट में एक सहायक अध्यापक के पद पे काम कर रहा हूँ। मेरे रिसर्च